When Kristin Smart disappeared, something far more troubling came to light. The police didn't act in those first critical hours. Hours that could have saved her life, or at least revealed the truth. It took more than 25 long years for an arrest to finally be made. And what about the father of the man convicted? Did he help cover up the secret, or was the system simply too weak to prove it? Nearly 3 decades later, these questions still hang heavy in the air. And as we search for answers, we uncover not just one crime, but a chain of failures that allowed the mystery to stretch on for a generation. My name is Detective Daniel. Welcome to Detective Daniel Files, where we search through America's darkest and most haunting missing cases. If you're new here, kindly subscribe and tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Before a case becomes headlines, before a name becomes a symbol, there is always a life, a person who mattered. And to understand the tragedy of Kristin Smart, we must first understand the young woman behind the name. Kristin Denise Smart was born on February 20th, 1977, in Stockton, California. She was the first daughter of Stan and Denise Smart, and from the beginning, her parents described her as someone who filled a room with light. She wasn't just a face in the crowd. Kristin had a presence, tall, athletic, and radiant. Friends said you noticed her, not just because of how she looked, but because of the energy she carried with her. Growing up in Stockton, Kristin loved adventure. She dreamed of seeing the world, of traveling, of doing more than just staying in one place. She loved the ocean, she loved photography, and she loved people. Her family recalls that she had a deep compassion for others. If someone was hurting, she wanted to be the one to comfort them. If someone felt left out, she was the one who pulled them in. But there was another side to her too, a teenager with big dreams, still figuring out who she was meant to be. Like so many young people, Kristin imagined a future that was wide open. She talked about becoming an architect, or maybe a teacher, or even working overseas. Her dreams weren't locked into one plan. What mattered most to her was possibility. Her bond with her family was unshakable. Her parents often spoke about how she would call home just to tell them about her day, even if it was something small. Her siblings looked up to her, not just as a sister but as a role model. She was the kind of daughter parents are proud to raise, and the kind of sister you want on your side. When it came time for college, Kristin wanted more than just classes and books. She wanted a place that would give her both education and adventure. She chose California Polytechnic State University, better known as Cal Poly, in San Luis Obispo. For her, it was the perfect blend: academics, the California coast, and the independence of living away from home. In 1996, Kristin began her freshman year. Like so many students, she faced the excitement of dorm life, new friends, new challenges, and the freedom that comes with being on your own for the first time. She lived in Muir Hall, a typical freshman dorm, filled with laughter, noise, and the endless energy of college youth. She had her whole life ahead of her. Those who knew Kristin at Cal Poly said she was still adjusting. Like many freshmen, she was trying to find her place. Sometimes she struggled with confidence, sometimes she felt a little lost. But that's part of the college experience, stepping into a bigger world and figuring out where you belong. And that's what makes this story so heartbreaking. Kristin was not a runaway, not someone trying to disappear. She was a young woman in the middle of her life's beginning. A daughter, a sister, a friend, a dreamer. Her freshman year was supposed to be the foundation for everything else: her career, her adventures, her future family, the decades of living still ahead. Instead, it was a year cut short in the most unimaginable way. Before she could finish even her first year, Kristin's name would become tied not to her dreams, but to a mystery. And that's why her story still matters today, because she was not just a victim, she was someone with a life worth remembering. It was Memorial Day weekend, 1996. Students at Cal Poly were celebrating the long holiday with parties, music, and late nights. For Kristin Smart, it was supposed to be just another weekend in her freshman year. That Saturday night, she joined friends at an off-campus party. People were drinking, laughing, and moving in and out of the small house. Kristin stood out, tall, confident, but also unsteady as the night went on. She had no money, no credit cards, nothing that suggested she planned to go anywhere but back to her dorm. Around 2 in the morning, things changed. Kristin was found lying on a lawn, too intoxicated to walk on her own.
Two students, Cheryl Anderson and Tim Davis, decided to help her. They guided her toward campus, steadying her as they walked in the dark. Then another student appeared, Paul Flores. He offered to take her the rest of the way, since his dorm was nearby. At first it seemed like kindness, but as Cheryl and Tim dropped away, Kristin was left alone with Paul. That walk from the party to her dorm should have been short, simple and safe. Instead, it was the last time anyone ever saw Kristin Smart alive. As the group made their way back to campus, one by one, Kristin's helpers peeled away. Tim Davis was the first to leave. He lived off campus, and he assumed Kristin was safe with the others. Soon after, Cheryl Anderson said goodnight too. She believed Paul Flores would walk Kristin the rest of the way. Now it was just the two of them, Kristin and Paul. She was unsteady, vulnerable, and completely dependent on him to get home. Paul later claimed he walked her as far as his dorm, Santa Lucia Hall, and then left her to find her own way back to Muir Hall. That was his story. But from that moment on, Kristin Smart was never seen again. No one remembers her entering her dorm. No one saw her the next morning. No phone calls, no bank cards, no trace at all. The campus grew quiet that night, but the silence that followed was more than sleep. It was the beginning of a disappearance that would haunt her family, her school, and the world for decades to come. The first hours after a disappearance are the most critical. Every investigator knows it. Time lost can mean evidence lost forever. But when Kristin Smart failed to return to her dorm, those hours slipped away. Campus police at Cal Poly didn't treat it as urgent. They assumed she had gone away for the long Memorial Day weekend, maybe with friends. Their response was casual, almost routine. A student missing. She'd turn up soon, they thought. But she didn't. And as the clock ticked, confusion set in. Who should take the case? The campus police or the San Luis Obispo Sheriff's Department? That handoff of responsibility caused delays, reports misplaced, and leads that weren't followed in time. There were no aggressive searches in those first days, no sealed dorm rooms, no full-scale hunt across the campus grounds. What should have been treated as an emergency was brushed off as a student simply being absent. By the time investigators realized something was very wrong, days had already passed. Evidence that might have been collected was gone, witness memories were fading, and the trail that could have led straight to Kristin was already going cold. Those early mistakes would cast a shadow over this case for the next 25 years. As investigators began to look closer, one name kept coming up, Paul Flores. He was the last person seen with Kristin, the one who was supposed to walk her safely home. Only days later, people noticed something strange. Paul had a black eye. His story of how he got it kept changing. First it was from basketball, then from working on his car. None of it added up. Students also whispered about his reputation. Women described him as creepy, someone who made them uncomfortable, someone they avoided whenever they could. On campus, people had noticed his behavior long before Kristin disappeared. Police finally searched his dorm room. But here another problem appeared. So much time had already passed. The room had been cleaned, students had come and gone, and any evidence that might have told the truth was either erased or overlooked. What they found was suspicious, but not solid. Inconsistencies in Paul's statements, odd details that didn't fit, enough to raise alarms, but not enough to bring charges. Paul Flores remained free, and with every day that passed the trail grew colder, and Kristin's family watched their hope begin to slip away. When Kristin stopped calling home, her parents knew something was wrong. She had always checked in, always let them know where she was. Silence was not like her. Stan and Denise Smart drove from Stockton to San Luis Obispo, hoping to get answers. What they found instead was confusion. Campus police told them Kristin had probably taken a trip. The sheriff's office said they had no proof of a crime. The family begged them to search harder, to act faster, but doors kept closing, and answers never came. Days turned to weeks, and the Smarts realized that if they didn't fight for their daughter, no one would. They put up billboards across California, pleading for information. They spoke to reporters, demanding that Kristin's story stay in the public eye. They lobbied lawmakers, determined that no other family should suffer the same silence they faced. Their grief became a mission. Every press conference, every interview, every late night at the kitchen table writing letters was powered by the hope that someone somewhere knew the truth about Kristin. But behind the fight, the pain was unbearable. A family that once gathered around the dinner table now lived with an empty chair. Every day without answers was another wound. And yet they refused to give up. Kristin's disappearance was no longer just a family tragedy. It was becoming a public battle, one that would stretch across decades. When a student goes missing, a university should be the first place to sound the alarm. But at Cal Poly, that didn't happen. Kristin Smart's disappearance exposed deep cracks in the school's safety system. At first, officials downplayed the danger. They suggested she had simply taken a trip, treating her absence as voluntary instead of suspicious. While every hour mattered, the university's policies slowed the response. Dorms weren't locked down, students weren't questioned aggressively, and the man last seen with Kristin, Paul Flores, continued to walk freely across campus. For her family, this was more than failure. It was betrayal. They believed Cal Poly had a duty to protect Kristin, and that duty had been broken. In time, the Smarts would file a lawsuit against the school, arguing that negligence and weak campus security contributed to their daughter's disappearance. The case shook the state of California. Lawmakers realized the system had to change. In 1998, the Kristin Smart Campus Security Act was passed. It required every public university in California to make formal agreements with local police, ensuring faster, stronger cooperation in cases of violence or missing students. The law carried Kristin's name, but for her family that was bittersweet. It meant progress, but it also meant her story had become a cautionary tale, a lesson carved out of tragedy. Cal Poly moved forward. New freshmen arrived. Classes went on. But for those who knew Kristin, the campus would never feel safe in the same way again. As the late 90s turned into the 2000s, Kristin Smart's case began to fade from headlines. Other stories filled the news cycle. New tragedies captured attention. And slowly her name slipped further from public memory. But for the Smart family, the search never ended. They drove thousands of miles to hand out flyers. They stood on sidewalks, spoke to reporters, and begged anyone with information to come forward. They raised billboards that read, "Where is Kristin Smart?" The years dragged on with no breakthroughs, no arrests, no answers. In 2002, 6 years after she vanished, the court declared Kristin legally dead. For her parents, it was a cruel formality, an acknowledgement that their daughter was never coming home, even though her body had not been found. Meanwhile, police said the case was still open. Investigators came and went, tips trickled in, and cadaver dogs were brought onto campus more than once. But every lead ended in frustration. Every search came up empty. The case stalled. Files sat on desks. Promises were made, then forgotten. And yet, a shadow lingered over San Luis Obispo. Everyone knew who the last person seen with Kristin was. Everyone knew where suspicion pointed. But without hard evidence, the silence continued. For the Smart family, the cold years were not just about waiting. They were about enduring the unbearable pain of living each day with no answers and no justice. For more than 20 years, Kristin Smart's case had gone cold. Files collected dust, and leads seemed exhausted. But then, out of nowhere, a voice outside of law enforcement changed everything. His name was Chris Lambert. He wasn't a detective. He wasn't a lawyer. He was just a local musician with a microphone, and a question that never left his mind. What really happened to Kristin Smart? In 2019, Lambert launched a podcast called Your Own Backyard. At first, it was a passion project, but his approach was different. He tracked down old witnesses, people who had been overlooked or ignored in the early years. He gave them space to speak. Stories that had been buried for decades finally came to light. One by one, people started to talk. They shared details about Paul Flores, about his troubling behavior, about moments that hadn't seemed important back then, but now fit into a much darker picture. The podcast exploded. Listeners around the country tuned in, and suddenly Kristin's case was back in the spotlight. Local authorities felt the pressure. The Flores family felt the heat. The silence that had lasted for decades was cracking open. Your Own Backyard wasn't just a podcast. It became a turning point. What police couldn't do for years, a single voice with persistence accomplished. Public awareness spiked, and momentum returned. For the first time in decades, Kristin's family felt a new kind of hope. The case was no longer forgotten. It was alive again. In April of 2021, the silence finally cracked. After 25 years of waiting, authorities made their move. Paul Flores was arrested, charged with the murder of Kristin Smart. His father, Ruben Flores, was taken into custody too, accused of helping cover up the crime. For decades, suspicion had hovered over them. But now, investigators revealed the evidence they had been building. Searches at Ruben's home uncovered soil samples beneath his deck, soil that showed signs of human decomposition. To prosecutors, it was proof that Kristin's body had once been buried there, before being moved. Paul faced the ultimate charge, murder during an attempted rape. Ruben was charged as an accessory, accused of hiding the evidence that could have revealed the truth long ago. When the arrests were announced, Kristin's family stood before cameras, their voices trembling. For years they had been told to wait. For years they had heard excuses, delays, and silence. And now, finally, the words they had been desperate to hear. Paul Flores has been charged with the murder of Kristin Smart. It was a moment of relief, but also heartbreak. Relief that someone would finally stand trial. Heartbreak because Kristin was still missing, her body still unrecovered. For the Smart family, it was not the end of their fight. But after 25 years of pain, it was the first real step toward justice. If this case troubles you, don't miss my ebook Predator Next Door. It reveals how to recognize hidden dangers in your own community and how to protect your family before it's too late. The link is in the description below. In 2022, the case that had haunted California for decades finally reached a courtroom, but not in San Luis Obispo, where it all began. The trial was moved to Monterey County after a judge ruled that Paul Flores could not receive a fair hearing in the community where suspicion had followed him for years. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution laid out their theory that on May 25, 1996, Paul Flores attempted to rape Kristin Smart in his dorm room. When she resisted, they argued he killed her. It was a theory built not on a body, but on a mountain of circumstantial evidence, witness accounts, and patterns of behavior. One by one, women testified. They described Paul Flores as a predator, a man who made them feel unsafe, a man who used alcohol and vulnerability to take advantage. Their stories painted a chilling picture of a pattern that stretched beyond Kristin's disappearance. The prosecution also turned its attention to Ruben Flores, Paul's father. They argued that Ruben helped cover up the crime, that Kristin's body had been buried beneath his deck, and later moved to keep investigators from finding her. Soil samples from his property, they said, revealed traces of human decomposition, evidence that someone had once been hidden there. The trial was a battle of testimony, science, and suspicion. For Kristin's family, sitting in the courtroom was both painful and necessary. After 25 years, they were finally hearing in public what they had believed all along, that Paul Flores was responsible for their daughter's death. But the question remained, would the jury believe it too? In October of 2022, after weeks of testimony and more than 2 decades of waiting, the jury returned with its decision. Paul Flores was found guilty of first-degree murder in the disappearance of Kristin Smart. For Kristin's family, those words were a mix of relief and heartbreak. Relief that someone was finally held accountable. Heartbreak because their daughter was still gone. His father, Ruben Flores, faced his own verdict. He was accused of helping to hide Kristin's body, but the jury found him not guilty. The evidence against him was suggestive, but not enough to convict. For many, that decision left lingering doubts and unanswered questions about just how far the cover-up may have gone. In March 2023, Paul Flores was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The court also ordered him to pay more than $350,000 in restitution to Kristin's family, money meant to cover the years of expenses, travel, and pain that came with keeping their daughter's case alive. Inside prison, Paul's story took another dark turn. Twice, he was attacked by other inmates, once in August 2023 and again in October 2023. The man who had once walked Kristin home now lives behind bars, facing a lifetime of punishment, not just from the system, but from the world around him. But for Kristin's family, even with the guilty verdict, even with the sentencing, the deepest wound remains. Kristin's body has never been found. Even with a guilty verdict, one truth remains painfully clear. Kristin Smart has never been found. Her body, the final piece of evidence, the piece that could answer so many questions, is still missing. Investigators believe she was first buried under the deck of Ruben Flores' home. Soil tests showed signs of human decomposition, but by the time they searched, the body was gone, moved, hidden, perhaps scattered to make sure she would never be recovered. Speculation has run wild over the years. Was she buried again in a new location? Was she hidden somewhere so ordinary no one thought to look? Or was she destroyed in a way that makes discovery impossible? For her family, the absence is unbearable. They have a conviction, but not their daughter. They cannot lay her to rest, cannot visit a grave, cannot place flowers where she should be remembered. Every parent clings to hope, but the Smarts are forced to live with an empty chair at the table and a wound that justice alone could not heal. Until Kristin is brought home, closure will remain out of reach. Even after conviction, the story of Paul Flores did not end. In the months following his sentencing, his lawyers filed an appeal. They argued that the trial was unfair, that evidence was mishandled, that testimony about his past behavior should never have been allowed. They claimed the jury was swayed more by emotion than fact. The court has agreed to hear the appeal, with oral arguments scheduled for 2025. For Kristin's family, it is another painful delay. They fear the case could be dragged out once again, reopening wounds that never truly closed. At the same time, the Smart family has launched their own legal fight. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Cal Poly, accusing the university of negligence.
They argue that weak campus security and slow response in 1996 created the perfect storm that allowed Kristin's disappearance to happen and to remain unsolved for so long. Decades later, the courtroom battles continue. On one side, Paul Flores fighting to undo his conviction. On the other, a grieving family pushing for accountability from the institution that failed to protect their daughter. Even with a guilty verdict, the fight for justice is far from over. Even with a conviction, this case refuses to rest. The questions remain, echoing across the years. Would Kristin have been found if police had acted faster in those first critical hours? Why did it take more than 25 years before an arrest was finally made? Can her family ever truly find peace when her body is still missing? And what about Ruben Flores? Did he really help hide the evidence, or was the system too weak to prove it? Could stronger safety rules at Cal Poly have prevented her disappearance in the first place? And finally, can a conviction ever feel secure when the victim's body has never been recovered? These are not just questions about one case. They are questions about how justice works and how easily it can fail. Kristin Smart's name now carries a legacy no one could have imagined. Her case forced changes in California law, leading to the Kristin Smart Campus Security Act, ensuring schools respond faster and cooperate better with law enforcement. Her story raised awareness about campus safety, showing parents and students that danger can exist even in the places we trust the most. Her family's perseverance, decades of billboards, press conferences, and public pleas, has inspired countless others to keep fighting when the system gives up. And her case proved the power of true crime media. A single podcast brought new life to a cold case, showing that voices outside the system can still push justice forward. Kristin Smart's life was stolen, but her legacy continues, through law, through awareness, through her family's fight, and through every person who refuses to let her story be forgotten. She stepped out for a party and never came home. Nearly 30 years later, her family still waits. A conviction without a body leaves an empty chair at the table and unanswered questions in the dark. If you found this case important, subscribe to Detective Daniel Files, share this video, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Download my ebook Predator Next Door for tools to protect your own family. And if you know anything, contact the FBI or San Luis Obispo Sheriff's Office. Until next time, stay aware, stay safe, and good night.